For this session's introductory Aramaic, we're going to be asking the question, what does written Aramaic look like? What kind of script is used? Is it alphabetic or something else? Well, it is alphabetic, actually, but it looks really different over time, and there's a number of different styles to this. So let's go ahead and just start asking the questions. Are these different alphabets? Are these different scripts when we talk about Aramaic and written Aramaic? I think sometimes when people talk about written forms of languages that they're not used to, especially when they don't look like anything that we see in Europe. And in Europe, we basically have three iterations of the alphabet, right? We have the Latin system, we have the Greek system, and then we have the Cyrillic system that, is tied largely to the Greek system. And even those, they're all pretty familiar to us, even in a place like, the Western world or the United States, where you have fraternities and things, or mathematics and physics, whatever. We see Greek letters all the time, right? Like there's a context for it. But when it comes to Middle Eastern languages and the way they're written, they look so different. So when we talk about the Aramaic alphabet, are there multiple alphabets? Are they multiple scripts? The way I think we should think of it, especially in the digital era, when we write with word processors, and that's normal. I mean, some of you watching wrote with typewriters back in the day, and you basically had one Courier font that you used for everything, right? Like there's no choice. It's just whatever the key would smack against the paper. Now we can select the fonts that we use. And I think that it might be helpful for us to think about the way Aramaic is written. And it's not just Aramaic. I mean, this could apply to Hebrew as well, because Hebrew goes through some similar transitions, maybe not as many as Aramaic does, but there are different fonts, and some of them look more developed, some of them look more cursive, some of them look more blocky. And if you were to go ahead and look at the scripts over time, you can kind of see some continuity to them. Maybe we should think about the way we write English, right? We have capitals and lowercase. We have cursive and Danilian, right? I don't know if they teach cursive anymore. I haven't seen young people writing in cursive in a long time, but it's still an important style. And so, well, maybe those are four different types of fonts that we use for our Latin alphabet that everyone encounters at some point. So that's four different styles. Maybe Aramaic's like that too, right? Some look more blocky, some look more cursive. So just let's go ahead and take a walk through all the different styles in which Aramaic is written. Here we have a background relief illustrating the different types of alphabetic writing that were used to write Aramaic, including Syriac. This actually, this was housed in the church hall at St. Ephrem Cathedral in Burbank, California for a number of years. I'm not sure where it is today, but it was there. And you can see, on the background, the different styles of writing, and these are all the same characters. Now, briefly, let's just go ahead and look at things that we see in the oldest days. Old Aramaic, it basically looks Phoenician. We call it Phoenician because the Phoenicians popularized it, and we start seeing some of the earliest texts, earliest inscriptions are actually in Phoenician. So in some places, we see a transition from actually Phoenician to different types of Aramaic over time, and it's natural. I mean, and this one on the left in particular, the Barakib inscription, very much follows that format. The Tel Fakhariya inscription does as well. And so this is the closest alphabet or closest version of Aramaic that we have to Latin or Greek. And it's because Latin and Greek are more tied to this style than the later developed styles. And in fact, once we see several hundred years pass and this development of Imperial Aramaic, you can kind of tell how the letters moved or how the scribes developed writing conventions. I'm just using the Unicode font sort of to show you kind of what the shapes are. This isn't a detail of all the specific letters, but we can look at them against actual texts. There's a text from Elephantine that you may have seen in the previous video. And so it's the same alphabet, but people are writing and it takes different shapes over time. The same can apply to the Nabatean or Palmyrene style of Aramaic. And in fact, if we look here at the Getty Villa, if you're able to ever visit this in Malibu, California, there's a number, or at least there were. I haven't been there in over a decade, so things could have changed. But they had a number of funerary stones there that had been taken out of Jordan and brought to different places in Europe, and eventually, collected in museums. But if you look very carefully, you can see the writing style here. Now, the most popular form we see publicly is something we might call Hebrew, but really we should call it Ktav Ashuri, or square Aramaic script. Why? Because there actually is a style that looks like the old Phoenician style, but it has its own little cursive flourishes, and that's something unique to Hebrew inscriptions from the ancient days. And so when later Hebrew language is written, it's written in periods where Aramaic has become the lingua franca of the Middle East. That is to say, the popular or the international language, the same way English might be viewed today. And so these characters are derived from the Ktav Ashuri, the Assyrian writing, or the square Aramaic script. Square because it's obvious each of the characters sort of fits in a square. Of course, I'm omitting the final forms of the characters here. Again, this isn't a specific study of the alphabet. I have other videos for that if you're interested. But this is simply just to showcase, how the look of this changes. And so if you were to study biblical Aramaic, you're going to see it written in this format. Next, we have a number of Syriac scripts. And so firstly, we have Syriac Estrangelo, which is the oldest form of Syriac. And a number of texts are still written this way. And sometimes if people want to make a title of something, they'll do the title in Estrangelo, and then they'll use one of the other fonts for the actual text proper. So it's not quite the same as having capitals and lowercase or majuscule and minuscule, but it is a different style, and maybe it's like all capital block, I guess you could say. But we don't have conventions where you would choose one of these letters, for, let's say, the names of nouns or the beginning of sentences, the way we use capitals in English. It just doesn't work that way. But they're still very prevalent, and sometimes they'll pop up, but more for calligraphic sake, like what fits the line best, what style looks the best. In the East, we have this style called Swadoyo or Swadaya, and it tends to be used, basically in places like Iraq. And in the West, western part of the Middle East, you have this style called Sirto, and Sirto is, again, another type of cursive. And so it's all the same alphabet, like going back to the ancient days, all of this stuff, no matter how old, we want to take it with Aramaic. Aramaic is written in an alphabet. And when we say alphabet, we mean A, B, G, D, right? Like, English, we say A, B, C, D. This happened in Latin. The original C, G, changed to a K, or it had two sounds to it. But in any case, it's still alphabetic. And so whether it's Syriac Aramaic, Old Aramaic, Imperial Aramaic, any of the other iterations, the Dead Sea Scrolls is a really pretty version of the square script that you can find online. If you're reading scriptural or biblical Aramaic, it's going to be in the square script. It's all alphabetic, and it's really all the same thing, but a different font. And it takes your eyes a little time to adjust and train to it. Maybe, some of our fonts, like, Times New Roman and Arial are pretty clear, but something like Gothic font might look different, and may take our eyes a little training to get used to the way some of the letters are written. If you read old German books that were printed like, in the early 1900s or the 1800s, they're written in Gothic script, right? They're printed, like the printing press prints them in Gothic script. And that can be a chore if you're not used to it. So maybe the way Aramaic is written is something like that. So when you see these different writing systems, don't think of them as writing systems, think of them as fonts. I don't want you to be discouraged, right? These forms of Aramaic, right? These are dialects of one common Aramaic umbrella language, right? And so the different writing styles, these different fonts, think of them as fonts. Don't think of them as different writing systems. Don't think of them as different alphabets. Don't think of them as something that, you really need to put a lot of time into learning. It once you kind of calibrate your eyes to it, it's not so different. So I want to encourage you, as you're going through and maybe learning one or both of these. This, I mean, basically Syriac and Biblical Aramaic. Again, the two most common that are studied. You can study any of these. In fact, a number of universities offer courses in Old Aramaic or Imperial Aramaic or Northwest Semitic inscriptions or something like this. So keep on keeping on. Know that these are basically the same thing, and experiment. If you've studied one or the other language, see if you can start to get it, right? See if you can start to figure out the way words are formed, the way they're written. And hey, maybe the Syriac is more like a cursive version of square Aramaic script. This is really interesting. Like, this is pretty easy. Now I get the hang of it, right? So think about it. If you studied one or the other, they're very much accessible. So that's where we're at for today. Pushun bashlomo, pushun bashlama, and get reading. Read one of these, experiment, try them out.